Thank you. I'm delighted to be a part of this program and very much appreciate Siddharth's remarks. I particularly like them because of the multivariate character, that the many factors that shape these complex relationship, and it was for me a little bit of a trip down memory lane of some of these events. What I'd like to focus on in my remarks are a couple of points that were made about what makes this version of the triangle different. To me, the most important factors are changes in India that come about with the end of the Cold War, that come about with the decision to open up the economy more, and the movement away from a very strict interpretation of what you characterize as the Nehruvian consensus. That, on the one hand, opened new possibilities for the United States. That there wasn't much incentive for the United States at the commercial level, and therefore at the governmental level, to try and engage very much with India economically, until the policies began to change in the early 90s. That the strategic triangle counterbalancing China, I think the idea comes later. I think it is not uniformly held. I think that those who speak geopolitics think this is more important than I do. I happen to think the economic dimension is more important. What I'd like to do is first lay that out and then comment on how I think the Chinese see that and the implications for China and for US-China. That I think the critical determinant of what happens over the next years, maybe decade, will be the Indian economy. The weakness that you point to is there. The flip side is there's enormous potential. Demographic advantages that India has to move into space that had been monopolized by China for a decade and a half. As China prices itself out of the market on labor, more importantly, as it imposes conditions, constraints, interference with foreign investment that makes it a not so good place to be, India has the capacity to reduce its license regime to make it more attractive to foreign businesses and take advantage of opportunities. I think that's going to happen for commercial reasons. And I think the Indian government will move, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but foreign firms will see the opportunity and want to move in. The Chinese will undoubtedly see this as a result of policy determinations made in Washington and other places. I think it's made in boardrooms around the world. That to the extent that India follows the export-led growth model that China has followed successfully, taking advantage of the liberal order, I think it can look forward to even faster rates of growth. As there's greater economic involvement with the United States, with Japan, with the Europeans, there is a greater incentive to think of India as part of the US security calculus. Not to push India into an alliance that goes beyond its desire for autonomy and not strictly as an anti-China hedge, but because there'll be something worth protecting and desire to have India play a larger role in system maintenance for the international community. That it's in many ways novel to be talking about this triangle because it wasn't very important for decades. The largest democracy versus the largest socialist system, and which would do better, and which competition, and the kind of anomalous way in which the US, the developed West, the OECD, moved closer to the socialist economy of the communist system of China than to India, despite the successful democracy, because the economy wasn't there, and the incentives weren't there. And the willingness to accept a little bit of engagement wasn't there. A little bit of entanglement wasn't there. That I don't think there was much notion of using India to counterbalance China, using China to counterbalance India until very recently. It kind of, where I see things playing out, that as the Soviet Union drew closer to India, India in its autonomous pursuit of foreign policy appeared to be closer, was closer to the Soviet Union than to the West. That was a problem for China. Well, China saw the Soviet Union as the biggest threat. India, not a problem for China. India by itself, a problem that could be managed by supporting Pakistan to harass and complicate Indian calculus. But it was India as an extension of the Soviet Union that was a problem. When the Soviet Union went away, that problem went away. For China, the possibility of a much better relationship with India was open. The economic possibility was open. It coincided in time with India's opening up. And it looked for a while like complementary economic interests would draw closer together. But the dynamic which you describe of the US and India drawing closer around the nuclear agreement began to make the Chinese more nervous, because in India, as an extension of appendage to, aligned with, in some way, the United States, was as worrisome, even more worrisome than the Soviet Union, because there was nobody to counter it. Where I go with this, and to bring my remarks to a conclusion, is I think the dynamics that are at work are going to be primarily economic. And that the economics will drive, should drive, India closer to a bunch of other democratic states, because that's where the other big markets are. The investment is, the technology complementarities are. That economic relations with China will increase, but it's going to be perceived by Beijing, I would hazard, and by much of the world, as a shift of investment from China to India, and be freighted with more political and geopolitical importance than I think it actually deserves. So the trick is going to be not balancing, limiting the economic potential, but in correctly presenting, depicting what the political relationship is, what the geopolitical dimensions of interdependence are, that you can trace back to economics, you can trace back to social and political common interests, and a hedging dimension, and keeping that separate from this is deliberately targeted at China or any other particular country. I'll close with the point you make is critical. Doing it at a time when there's uncertainty, instability in the leaderships, in the policies, in the visions of all three legs of this triangle, or corners of this triangle, means we need to be probably very lucky as well as very skillful to manage this over the next few years. And journalism has a big role to play in that. Having been on the government side, what most political actors, politicians, members of legislatures use as the basis for their understanding of the world is what they read in the media. And they pay attention to that because that's what their constituents read. So journalists getting it basically right and pointing the analysis and the argument in the proper direction is critical to the ability to make sensible policies. So I am delighted that you have received this award. Thank you for making the presentation. And I'll now turn it back to Dan.